For these past few weeks, Nathan has been leading us down this journey that we've been going through the book of Peter. First Peter, in fact, the first letter that the disciple Peter wrote, as Nathan pointed out last week, to this Gentile group of Christians living in a world full of suffering around 40 years after Jesus had died and risen, where at this point there were only a few thousand Christians on the earth at the time, where it felt like for these receivers of this letter, they had to feel isolated because there were not many Christians at this point yet. And somehow Peter is writing to them with one four-letter word as the main theme in this book, in this letter to them. The small four-letter word of hope. And as Nathan has pointed out multiple times in his past few messages, he doesn't really like this word hope. Because what we've done with it in our culture, in our society today, as Nathan has pointed out, we have stripped it of the meaning that's truly behind the word hope that Peter was trying to convey to those Christians a couple thousand years ago. We have rid it of the true meaning of it, and we've replaced it with something like, I sure hope the Cardinals don't get last in the division this year. Well, if I'm actually being honest with you, I do hope the Cardinals get last in the division. I'm a Cubs fan, and last week Nathan said, hope requires honesty, so I'm going to be honest and hope that you guys will forgive me for that. You see, hope, it's a lot more than hoping in your sports team's future. And that's what Peter's writing to these Christians that are feeling isolated in the midst of suffering about. He's giving them this hope because if you've listened really attentively to Nathan over the last few weeks, he's included this phrase, hope gives you a new reality. And that's what we're going to talk about today. That new reality that the hope of Jesus brings you into. Now, you hear that phrase, hope gives you a new reality, but at the same time, I don't have to convince anyone in this room that you could go home from this church this morning, turn on your TV, and turn on at least 5 different channels, and you would be presented with the fact that we live in a world full of suffering. Within 5 minutes, you would hear about the wars in the world, you would hear about the sickness that is ravaging, you would hear about murder and crime, and you would come face to face with the truth that even though we have this new reality that we've been brought into, there's still suffering. And a lot like those Christians that Peter was writing to in this book, we too can tend to feel isolated in this post-Christian world and environment that we live in. It can kind of feel like we're told that the only way to get through this life is to close our fists and white-knuckle it, and just one day things are going to get better. But that's not the kind of hope that Peter was writing to these Gentile Christians about. That's not the kind of hope that Jesus actually gives us. He gives us a new reality right now. And that new reality is in the midst of this suffering world, and in the midst of feeling like you're isolated. But the hope is that you're actually not isolated. And so in order to get there, we're going to look at the story of Peter, the disciple who wrote this letter. We're going to look at his life, and we're going to look at a few scenes throughout his life, because Peter also didn't always understand this reality. You see, Peter, he was born a Jew. His backstory is that he was growing up in Israel about 400 years after the last prophet had been sent by God to talk to his people. And so for the Jews that were living under Roman occupation, for someone like Peter, it had to kind of feel like those Gentile Christians that he was writing to, where this concept of hope wasn't really a reality that he was living in, but it was really more just a concept that was in his mind. It was just something that he was told and kind of believed in, but it wasn't real to him, because nothing had happened for the last 400 years. And so there's this promise of this Messiah coming, but he's really not sure what's going to happen. And so that brings us to Peter in the Gospels. Because Peter has some really high points in the Gospels, and he also has some really low ones. He has some times in his life where this text, it looks like the exact opposite of what he believed in and what he was doing. But at the end of his life, this text came to define the life of Peter, because that's what this text is. The new hope that you receive, that there is a new reality for you, can be defined in 3 very simple words. Being a Christian. That's what your hope is. And Peter's life points to that. And so we're going to go to scene 1, Peter's call. In Luke chapter 5, you can turn in your Bibles there if you'd like, we see how Peter is out on a lake fishing with his brother Andrew. They're fishing on the Sea of Gennesaret. And they've been there all night. This is their trade. Their profession is fishing. They're experts at it. And all night long, they don't catch a single fish. And so I'm sure there was some hostility between the few of them. They were actually out with their friends James and John. And I'm sure that there was some badgering between them, like, why didn't we fish in that spot over there? Or we should have tried harder. Maybe we should stay out a little bit more. But as the sun rose that day, they decided to call it quits. Fishing was their livelihood. It was how they put food on their plates, and it was how they cared for their family and put a roof over their heads. It was what allowed them to pay the insane taxes in order to stay a Jew in the Roman-occupied system that they lived in. And so maybe they were talking and worrying about how they were going to pay their next taxes because they hadn't caught any fish. And they come in from the sea. They come into the shore, and as they get to the shore, up walks Jesus, and behind him is this crowd. Now we have to pause here because this actually isn't the first time in the Gospels that Peter and his brother Andrew encounter Jesus. The first time that they actually encountered Jesus was back in John 1, where John the Baptist had pointed at Jesus and said, he's the Messiah. He's the dude that this concept of hope in a Messiah being promised from God had turned into just a concept. He actually was him. And Andrew happened to be one of John the Baptist's disciples. And he went and followed Jesus home that very night and had a slumber party with him, essentially. He learned from him, and the very first thing that he did the next morning was go and grab his brother Peter, who was called Simon at the time, and brought him to Jesus. And that was where he got the name Jesus. That first instance, the first time Peter meets Jesus, the only thing that happens is Peter tells him, you're going to be called Peter now. And so now back to the beach in Luke 5. They've come in after a failed night of fishing, worried, maybe a little bit angry. And Jesus, he looks at them and he goes, is it okay if I teach from your boats so that everyone who's present here can hear? And I'm sure there was at least a part of them that wanted to say no. There's at least a part of them that said, dude, I just want to get my boat in and I want to go home and I want to sleep it off and forget about this failed last night. But there was something about him that made them, that caused them to let him do it. And so he got in their boat, and he taught the people. And when he finished teaching, he looked at Peter and he looked at Andrew, and he said, okay, now cast your boats back into the middle of the sea and throw your nets in one more time. Now this is Jesus. He's a rabbi. He's teaching the law, and he's teaching the prophets. He's a carpenter's son. He doesn't know anything about fishing. Why would they listen to him? They're the experts that if there was ESPN back then, you would turn it on, and they were the ones in the Bass Pro fishing series. Why would they listen to him? Well, there was something about what he had said or something that they had seen him do that made them trust him. And so they did it. And when they threw their nets in and pulled it in, there was more fish than their boat could hold. They were overfilling with fish. And so when they came back to shore and they finally brought all the fish with them, Peter, his reaction, his response, it was to run up to Jesus and fall at his feet on his knees and say, depart from me, for I am a sinner. He realized something internally, that there's something different about this Jesus guy than me. And he said to depart from me. Only Jesus, that's not how he greeted Peter. He looked at Peter as he's kneeling there saying, depart from me. He doesn't say, okay, I'll walk away. He doesn't say, you're right, you're broken, there's something completely wrong with you. No, he brings Peter into a new reality. He tells Peter, drop your nets, you're not going to fish for fish anymore. You're going to come with me and you're going to be a fisher of men. He tells him to follow him. And from that point on, Peter was brought into this new reality of hope. And it's funny that in our text, when Peter talks when we're called by God in our baptism, that he compares it to another instance where there was a guy who, what he was called by God to do was get into a different boat on some different water in order to be brought into his own reality of himself. Noah and his family, he corresponds the ark and the flood to our baptism when we were called. When Peter was called, Jesus began that call in the midst of Peter's boat. And he called him out of it into a new reality. Only sadly, this scene doesn't fully encapsulate Peter's life as a disciple. We have to go to scene 2. See, every gospel, it hinges on the same turning point. There's a point where the gospels turn in their narrative of the life of Jesus. And I think that the most clear hinge is in Matthew's gospel in the 16th chapter. In Matthew 16, the way the conversation goes is Jesus, he approaches his disciples one day and he walks up to them and he goes, "Who do you guys say that I am?" Or who do other people say that I am? And Matthew, he doesn't explain exactly how they come to this conclusion. Maybe they came in a huddle and they talked about it and then they elected a spokesperson for the group. Or maybe they all said it simultaneously. Or maybe, as I kind of like to picture it, Jesus asked, "Who do people say that I am?" And Peter said, "Well, some people say you're Elijah." And then John said, "Well, some people say you're John the Baptist." And then Matthew's like, "Well, some people say you're one of the other prophets." And Jesus, he kind of just like, "Okay, well, you guys are my 12 best friends in the entire world. You're who I'm doing life with. Who do you say that I am?" And it's only one person this time instead of the 12 that speak up. It's just Peter. And it's probably the high point of any human experience in all of human history. Peter got to confess right before the physical Jesus, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus, he rewards him. He says, "Simon," he reaffirms him of the new name that he had given him previously. He said, "You are called Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." And he goes on to explain what it means that he's the Christ, the Son of God. He tells Peter and the rest of the disciples, "Okay, I'm the Christ, yes." And what that means is we're going to now have this hinge. We're going to turn. Things are not going to be random anymore. We're going to go to Jerusalem. That's our end game. That's our destination. And what's going to happen in Jerusalem is I'm going to get killed. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to be beaten. And I'm going to hang on a cross and die. And then 3 days later, I'm actually going to be raised from the dead. And Peter, bless his heart, just as quickly as 30 seconds ago he had correctly answered that Jesus was the Christ, he butts in and rebukes Jesus. He says, "No, Lord, you are not going to die. I won't let you suffer." And if I'm being honest, I completely understand the perspective that Peter has here. I mean, up to this point in the ministry of Jesus, the only things that Peter has seen Jesus do is the exact opposite of what he's saying he's going to do. Up to this point, he's seen Jesus feed 5,000 people. He's seen Jesus heal lepers and women who can't stop bleeding for 12 years and people that are blind. He even saw him raise a girl from the dead. And so if I'm Peter and Jesus is saying, "Okay, I'm about to go suffer and die," that wouldn't make any sense to me. Because everything that he's seen and experienced with him up to this point has been life and healing, not suffering and death. And then I also think there's a little part in the inside of Peter that could have been worried about what would happen if Jesus actually did go suffer and die. Like, if that actually happened, how isolated would Peter be then? I mean, he was isolated beforehand, waiting on the Messiah. And now this time, he's given up his trade of fishing. So what does he have to go back to? He has no other way of living. And so he's like, "No, Lord, I can't let you suffer, because what would that mean for me?" He hadn't quite yet understood what he penned in our letter in verse 18, "For Christ suffered once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, that we might be brought to God." He understood that he was the Christ, but he didn't understand what that meant for him as an unrighteous person and for everyone in the world who was unrighteous. That Jesus needed to do this, needed to suffer in order to bring us to God. Well, eventually he's going to figure it out, and so let's go to scene 3 and see if it happens there. You see, in scene 3, Jesus and his disciples, they've gotten to Jerusalem. They've come into Jerusalem. You guys all know how it happens. He came on the back of a donkey to the shouts of Hosanna and praise. And when they get there, it's the Passover, and Jesus, he celebrates the Passover feast. That's the highest holiday of all of the Jewish year, where they remember when God had delivered them out of Egypt, out of slavery, out of bondage, and delivered them into the promised land, eventually. And when they remembered that, they celebrated it together, Jesus and his 12 best friends. And they had remembered this great celebration, and they had shared this great meal. And at the end of the meal, Jesus, he looks across the table, and he looks at Peter, and he goes, "Okay, Peter, in the next few hours, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. I mean, if you put yourself in Peter's shoes, how does that sound? I mean, for the last 3 years, you have walked and talked and learned from and seen all the miraculous stuff that this dude has done. That doesn't make any sense that you would deny him. You've given up your life to follow him. You were the only disciple who professed him as the Christ. And I mean, James and John, like a week ago, had went to him and asked if they could have reserved seating in the age to come. Judas, 5 minutes ago, Jesus said was going to betray him. So don't you mean he's going to deny you, not me? No, Jesus meant Peter. And so after the supper, they get up, and Jesus actually took his 3 best friends, Peter, James, and John, and went to the Garden of Gethsemane. And when they got to the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas, he was in the process of turning Jesus over to the Roman guards in exchange for 30 pieces of silver. And Judas, he brought some of the Roman guards, and he brought some of the high priest's servants with him to the garden to turn Jesus over to them. And when they got to the garden, Jesus asked them, "Who are you here for?" And they responded that we're here for Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus goes, "That's me." And they go, "Okay, well, what's going to happen is we're going to capture you and we're going to take you away." And Peter, he thinks that this is his chance. This is his chance to prove to Jesus that he's actually not going to deny him 3 times. And so his response to the guards coming up and attempting to capture Jesus is to pull a sword from his side and chop off one of the high priest servant's ears. And Jesus says, "That's not how we do things, Peter." And he picks up the guy's ear and puts it back on his head. See, Peter thought that he was making a proper defense for Jesus in that moment, but he actually wasn't. And so Jesus, he gets taken off by the guards, and they take him in front of the high priest where he's tried. And in John, we learn that John and Peter followed them there. And when they went there, John, he had the guts to go inside, but Peter, maybe it was because he was feeling ashamed for cutting the guy's ear off. Maybe it's because he wasn't feeling great about what Jesus had told him earlier in the night about denying him 3 times. Or maybe it was something else. He stayed outside in the courtyard warming himself by a charcoal fire, just within earshot of the conversation that was going on inside. Another reason that Peter could have cut off that guy's ear is that he didn't want Jesus to be separated from him. He didn't want to be re-isolated from Jesus. What would happen if they actually do take him and kill him? Am I never going to be able to be with him again? And so as he's warming himself by this fire, those thoughts have to be going through his mind. And while he's warming himself by the fire, there's a servant girl, and she comes up beside Peter, and she asks him, "Aren't you a Galilean who knows that man that's on trial up there?" And he looks at her and he says straight to her face, "No, I don't know who that is." And then a little while later, another servant girl comes up and asks him, "Don't you know that man that's on trial?" And Peter looks at her and he says, "I do not know him." And then a little while later, another one of the servants of the high priests, as John says, one of the relatives of the man who had his ear cut off, he might have been there in the garden, comes up to Peter and says, "I know that you know that man. You're a Galilean like him." And Peter denies him a 3rd time. And it says, instantly the rooster crowed, and he departed and wept. In Luke, it says that he locked eyes and made eye contact with Jesus across the courtyard. You see, Peter, in his text that we read from today, it says, "Always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is within you." At that point in Peter's life, I would say he had no idea how to make a defense for the hope that's inside of him. His idea of making a defense was taking out a sword and chopping off someone's ear, possibly trying to split their head in half, and then openly denying Jesus to the social stigma of 2 teenage girls. That doesn't sound like a very good defense to me. Well, as you all and I know, Jesus gets put before Pilate, he gets accused, he ends up having to hang on a tree, suffer, he gets beaten, and he dies on a tree. 3 days later, God raised him from the dead. And in Mark, there's this really interesting detail that's included in the resurrection account. When Jesus, he appears to Mary Magdalene and Mark, she's told, go and tell his disciples, especially Peter, that he will meet them in Galilee. Especially Peter. It's almost like the Holy Spirit, who inspired these scriptures that we read, wanted everyone throughout all of history to know that Peter really knew that he messed up. Especially Peter needs to know that Jesus is going to meet you in Galilee. And so she does, and they're waiting for him in Galilee. They're waiting in the upper room. That's the story where he comes and he sees Thomas, only we don't really hear much from Peter in that first meeting, in that first encounter after the risen Jesus sees his disciples. And as I talked with one of my professors this last week about this, we both thought that it had to be the case that Peter was still feeling incredibly ashamed for having denied Jesus 3 times after having been told by Jesus, you're going to do it. But maybe he was off in the corner, didn't say a word that entire time. And now we get to the final scene of Peter. In the Gospel of John, we hear about how after Jesus had appeared to them, Peter and the rest of the disciples actually go back to Peter's old reality. They go back fishing again. And in chapter 20 of John, it's actually mentioned that it's at the exact same lake that 3 years ago Peter had been called by Jesus at. And just like that instance 3 years ago, they had gone all night without catching a single fish. And so we only have 2 instances of Peter fishing in the Gospels, but it's actually a pretty good thing that this dude got called to be a disciple because he's not a very good fisherman. And after an all-night long failure of fishing yet again, they're giving up and going into the shore. But who walks on the beach but Jesus? That same beach that he had walked up to Peter and Andrew on 3 years ago. And none of the disciples recognize that it's him, and he tells them, friends, throw your nets in the water one more time. And they do. They don't recognize that it's Jesus, but they throw their nets in and they pull them out, and as they're pulling them out, John numbers the fish. It's 153 fish that they catch. So many that their boats can't take it. And John realizes that it's got to be Jesus. And he tells Peter, that's Jesus on the beach. And Peter, his response to that is to jump up, put his cloak on, and jump into the water and swim to Jesus. Now, there's a lot of people who like to romanticize this swimming of Peter here because they like to talk about how he was so elated that he got to see Jesus that he wanted to get there first. And that's obviously possible. But I think it's probably a little bit more likely that Peter was ashamed and he wanted to get there before the other disciples because he knew that there was a hard conversation that was about to be had. Because he felt like he had been isolated from Jesus and isolated from the other 10. Because he felt like he didn't belong with Jesus, that Jesus didn't want anything to do with him. There's no way that he could. He had just denied him 3 times. And he went and hid just like the rest of the disciples, but he didn't belong with them because at least they didn't deny him to people. Well, Peter doesn't get there before the other disciples. They all get there at about the same time, and Peter helps them drag the net into the beach, and when they get to the beach, Jesus is cooking them breakfast. And it's actually been proven that for us, in our memories as humans, the sense that triggers our memory the most is that of smell. It's why when you walk into your grandmother's house, no matter at what point in your life it is, it has that same distinct smell that triggers all those memories of your childhood when you were there. It's why when you walk into your parents' house for the first time after coming home from college, when your mom's making that favorite dish that you have, you think of all those other times in your life that you've made it. And Peter, when he got to that beach for breakfast that day, Jesus was cooking them fish on a charcoal fire, and that would have triggered in his memory that night when he had denied Jesus 3 times outside by a charcoal fire. And so if it hadn't already been on his mind for the last couple weeks, it sure as heck was then. And they ate breakfast together. And when they finished breakfast, Jesus pulled Peter aside and he said, Peter, do you love me more than these? Now, some people think that Jesus is talking about the other disciples. And that's absolutely possible, but I think he's more than likely talking about the fish. Do you love me more than this old reality that you've gone back to? Do you love me more than these 153 fish that you guys have just caught? And Peter, he looks back at Jesus and he goes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus says, okay, well then tend my lambs. And he asks him again, Jesus goes, Peter, do you love me? And Peter goes, Lord, you know that I love you. Okay, well then tend my sheep. And then he asks him a 3rd time. And after asking him a third time, saying, Simon, do you love me? It says that in his heart, Peter was grieved because of the 3 questions that were asked of him. And so it's obvious that he was thinking back to those 3 denials. And he answers Jesus, he says, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus says, okay, well then feed my sheep. And I think it was in that moment, while on the same beach that Jesus had called him on 3 years prior, that it finally clicked for Peter. The new reality that he had been called to finally clicked for him. That the only way that he was able to experience this new reality was that Jesus, the Christ, suffered, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might be brought to God now. The only way that he was able to write this letter to these Gentile Christians, to actually have tangible hope now and not have it be a concept in his mind, was that even though Peter had denied him a few weeks prior, Jesus still wanted him to be feeding his sheep. It's not that he didn't want anything to do with Peter, it's that he wanted everything to do with Peter. And that's the promise that Jesus had for his disciples when he departed at the end of Matthew. He says, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. That is the hope that Peter's writing to these Gentile Christians about. It's not that our only hope is in the fact that something's going to come in the future, but our hope is in something that is a new reality now. A new reality that you get to live in and experience right now. That Jesus looks you in the eye and he says, I am with you to the very end of the age. I am the righteous one. I have suffered for you, the unrighteous. And as a result of that, you've been brought to God. That promise was true over Peter, that promise was true over these Gentile Christians, and that promise is true for you and for me today. In the name of Jesus, amen.